This is NNI Bites, Big Learnings, a podcast where fellow healthcare professionals converse about the latest in nutrition science. We are joined by the chairs and speakers of NNI and WNSC Workshop 103 as they share practical insights on early life nutrition and its impact on children's long-term well-being.
Hello and welcome to NNI Bites Big Learnings. I'm your host, Raanan Shamir, and today we are joined by Professor Ciarán Forde from Wageningen University. He is an expert in sensory science and eating behavior. Professor Forde, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Raanan. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let me start by asking you about your early development research. It highlights dramatic anatomical changes in the first 2 years of life. Can you explain how these changes, such as jaw, tongue, and muscle development, set the stage for learning to eat and chew?
Certainly. So in the first 24 months of life, there are dramatic anatomical changes that occur from the move from infancy and a largely liquid diet through to complementary feeding around 6 to 8 months, and then on into moving to family foods. And during this period, concurrently, along with the dietary shifts, there's also huge changes in the way children learn to eat, learn to chew and bite and swallow, alongside changes in the oral anatomy and dental physiology around this mechanisms that support chewing and swallowing safely. And so importantly, all of this is learned. We're not born with an innate ability to know how to bite, chew or swallow. And of course, it's learned at an incredibly rapid period of growth and development. So you have the emergence of deciduous teeth, your palate doubles in length, it widens and lengthens to create space for these teeth. You have initially when you're born, fat deposits in your cheeks, which are there to hold your tongue in place and to minimize the risk of choking, but also create a good vacuum for liquid feeding in a supine position. And then within a matter of months, you have to adjust to sitting upright with independent feeding and learn how to bite, chew and swallow different types of lumpy textures initially, and then eventually solid foods and textures where you have to crush them to a swallowable bolus. And again, all of this is learned, so there's no opportunity to be born with this innate ability. And so the challenge for children in this period, of course, or infants in this period, is to adjust their learning through texture exposure and to understand what is the power of their jaw, how to move food around and develop the fine motor skills to be able to crush food effectively and to swallow safely. And then through experience, they have an opportunity to expand their dietary exposure and broaden their dietary preferences for different types of textures.
Thanks. So if we talk about the role of texture exposure, why is early exposure to different food textures so important for oral development and later eating behavior?
Well, it's incredibly important because, of course, there's a reciprocal relationship. It's not just about learning texture and what's safe to eat and how to process it for safe swallow. In the very act of chewing is also, of course, helping to extend your palate, create space for the movement of your tongue and for the emergence of these teeth, stimulating healthy saliva flow and good oral development. So there's a combination of both exposure for learning, to learn the skills needed to coordinate the 31 muscles and nerves in your orofacial region. But in doing so, you also are helping to develop the anatomy and physiology around chewing and swallowing too. So there's this very beneficial synergistic relationship between the two.
Thank you. So we talked about early exposure. What does the evidence say about the risks of delaying the introduction of lumpy or textured foods beyond, let's say, 9 months?
Well, I suppose in the same way that there's a reciprocal relationship between texture exposure and texture preferences and ability to chew and your oral anatomy, if you delay that exposure, you of course also have a concurrent impact on both preferences, dietary exposure, and potentially even oral development. So delayed exposure, the data to date on longitudinal and prospective cohort studies has suggested that the delayed introduction of lumpy foods, for example, can lead to increased feeding difficulties in later childhood, increased food fussiness, and a reduction in the consumption of things like fruits and vegetables. Similarly, there could be concurrent developments where you have a narrow palate, which also maybe results in not enough space for deciduous teeth to emerge, causing crooked teeth to emerge, and then later dental problems too. And so the advice would be, of course, alongside estrogen guidance, to introduce solid foods in the sort of 6 to 8 month period, and start to slowly increase the texture challenge from initially smooth purees to more lumpy foods, and then eventually on to more bite-sized pieces of solid foods, concurrent with the development of oral anatomy and the development of deciduous teeth.
Thanks. So we talked about when, not too early, not too late. Let's talk about how. And you're talking about repeated exposures. How does repeated exposures to new texture in foods influence the child acceptance and preferences?
Well, directly, of course, we learn food through exposure. We're not born with any innate preferences other than maybe a preference for sweet foods, but everything else has to be learned. And it's one thing to suggest introducing textures and introducing new foods, but of course it also has to be age appropriate in terms of the developmental stage of the child. And so initially when the children's teeth start to emerge, they'll initially have incisors, which are good for gripping and tearing foods. Then subsequently canines will develop. These in turn will also help to tear and break off pieces. And so you can move from bite-sized pieces or spoon feeding through to child-led feeding. And then later with the emergence of the first molars, you can also see more efficient chewing efficiency. And with each new texture, the child has the opportunity to develop and learn new functional skills. And in doing so, will also experience how to manage boluses, learn the sensory cues that can stimulate the soft palate to drop, in terms of safe swallowing, and these all have to be learned effectively. But in doing so, then you'll also have a broader opportunity to expose the child to a wider dietary variety. In terms of the time period for the exposure, there are sensitive periods between sort of 4 to 6 months when you start to slowly taper off on the liquid feeding and start to introduce semi-solids. And then from 6 months onwards, you can start to complementary feeding and introducing more complex textures, and then respond to the child's behaviors and their development as they start to learn how to handle slightly more complex textures. The secret to mere exposure, of course, is to persist with it, because oftentimes parents are nervous about giving children new textures, and of course they're often rejected initially, but repeated exposure has been shown to increase preferences over time for initially difficult or rejected foods, both for fruits and vegetables, but also for initially rejected textures.
Great. So we talked about repeated exposures. I want to dive into eating behaviors and ask you, what if studies like the Gusto taught us about the relationship between early eating behaviors such as eating rate or portion size and later risk of overweight or obesity?
So I was lucky enough to work on the Gusto cohort, which was a large birth cohort in Singapore for a number of years. And there we have a mother-child dyad cohort of around 1,200 children-parent pairs who've been followed from birth. And we had the opportunity to study their eating behaviors at around 4.5, 6, and 6 years of age. So over time, we could start to track the same children in about 400 or 500 of these children. And what we were able to do is just observe how children ate, and then from that, understand what might be the behaviors linked to differences in energy intake, and how also did that track with growth outcomes in the same group of children. And with doing so, we were able to identify sort of a series of, we would term obesogenic eating styles that were common in children who tended to consume more energy within meals in a consistent way, and also which tracked against things like changing adiposity and BMI Z scores over time. And this related to things like eating at a faster rate, eating for longer, having larger ad libitum portions, eating in the absence of hunger in terms of spontaneously wanting food and snacking, and linked to a wide range of other types of impulsive behaviors around food, which we could sort of see as an association with inhibition control as well. Importantly, these behaviors emerged early, they seem to be stable over time, and they track with changes in body composition over time. So in knowing that these behaviors are linked to ad libitum energy intake and potentially causally linked to higher adiposity, it creates opportunities to think of new solutions to change how children interact with food, and to provide parents with guidance on how to avoid these kinds of obesogenic eating behaviors. What was really interesting is that children vary in their obesity risk factors in terms of those that are accumulated in the first 1,000 days. But when we were modeling this at the level of the whole cohort, we could see that the children who made the transition from at risk to overweight and with obesity tended to be children who exhibited these obesogenic eating styles. In other words, having the risk wasn't enough to make the transition. You also had to transition to eating at a faster rate, choosing larger portions, eating in the absence of hunger, and consistently having larger portion sizes and larger ad libitum intakes. So it creates clues as to what we could do in terms of making the association back to practical advice through parents on how to avoid these kinds of behaviors in children who may be at risk from developing overweight or obesity.
Well, so this is the scientific evidence for sure. In short, taking all these findings and the physiology that you elaborated on, what practical advice would you give to healthcare professionals and counseling parents on supporting healthy eating behaviors?
I think a lot of research to date has focused really on sort of early life taste exposure and things like that, but we tend to ignore or overlook the important role the texture plays, not just in terms of preferences, but also in terms of anatomy and physiology development. Children like what's familiar and they eat what they like. And so repeated exposure for taste works, and repeated exposure for texture not only works in terms of broadening children's preferences and exposure, but also helps to develop the oral anatomy better as well. So the practical advice will be that many parents are probably afraid to introduce textures at certain points, but they should also then be able to think about trying to extend the range of their child's texture exposure, bearing in mind that every new tooth brings additional functionality in terms of oral processing. Every new texture offers an opportunity to learn how to manipulate food in the mouth in a way that's safe and easy to swallow. And so if you rely only on cues like age or the number of teeth, it can sometimes be misleading. Actually, its texture exposure is a much better guide of the children who are better prepared for handling more complex or challenging textures, biphasic textures or textures with lumps, textures that require multiple different types of operations to break it down, to lubricate it and form a bolus for safe swallow. So if every texture offers an opportunity to create a new set of skills, in the longer run, you're equipping your child with new skills to take on the complexities of a much more diverse diet and be much more open to new flavors and textures in the future by providing them with this texture exposure in early life.
Thank you so much. So we are coming towards the end of our podcast. So if you could leave our listeners with one key message about learning to eat in early life, what would it be?
Sure, Raanan, no problem. Your anatomy will develop anyway, but behaviors are learned. So growth will continue with chronological age, but to adapt to that growth and manipulate food in a safe way that encourages better health, we have to learn those behaviors. So the short message would be simply support your child to transition to solid foods through texture experiential learning in a stepwise way, and it'll equip them for life in terms of loving food and also having a better oral anatomy and the set of skills they need to process that food safely.
Amazing. So thank you, Professor Forde, for sharing your insights. And thank you to our audience for joining us on NNI Bites Big Learnings. Stay tuned for more conversations where science, nutrition, and innovation come together to build a healthier future, starting from early life.
And that concludes today's episode. Thank you for joining us for this special episode from NNI and WNSC Workshop 103. We hope you enjoyed and learned from this quick discussion, fellow experts. Till the next episode.